Good evening, everybody. I am really excited to be with you again tonight. Ever since we had this idea of jumping into a new series, and really, again, the inspiration for the series came from Hebrews chapter 11, where we get a list of names, men and women who lived during Old Testament times, and each one of them is on display for us to imitate. They are an example to us. They are heroes of the faith. And so last week we explored the lives of two twin brothers, Cain and Abel. And what we learned is that God desires our very best. If you remember the story, two brothers bring their sacrifices. By the way, it's not like Cain didn't bring something, but what he brought did not find favor with God. Cain brought what he wanted, not what God deserved. On the other hand, we saw Abel bringing the best of what he had. He didn't just bring something, he brought the best of what he had, which was really an indication of where his heart was at. And when God looked at Cain with displeasure, you would think that in that moment, Cain would say, I got to make this right. And God was patient with him and tried to help him. And Cain responded in a flippant way toward God, further proving where his heart was at. And we made this simple statement. God always looks at the giver first and then the gift. God always looks at the giver first and then the gift. As we continue to read through those names in Hebrews chapter 11, we come to the name of Noah. Many people are familiar with the name and the story behind the name. But before we get into the story, I realized last week I should have brought something to us in preparation for the entire series, and that is an understanding of what faith is. When Hebrews 11 starts, it talks about the importance of faith, giving the examples of faith, but then you also get an understanding or a definition of faith. Faith is assurance of things not seen. Faith is an understanding that leads to a conviction, and that conviction then leads to a commitment. But faith begins with understanding. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, we read this. By faith we understand. Stop there. How many Christians have I spoken to who say, I just feel like I just don't want to have a blind faith. Man, how many times have you heard that from me? The Christian faith is the furthest thing in the world from a blind faith. Our faith is based on an understanding. How many people have you spoken to that have said something like this? I can't be a Christian because I have a brain. I can't be a Christian because I'm a thinking person. I can't be a Christian because I'm just far too rational. What does the verse say? Isn't this interesting? By faith, we what? We understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Christians understand that the universe is not self-explaining. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul writes and says this, God can be known. God can be understood. What happens when you understand something? You use your mind. You use your ability to reason. God can be understood. How so? Through creation. Through what has been made. You see, we understand that design implies a what? Designer. We understand that the more complicated, the more ordered the design, the more intelligent the designer. We understand that. By faith, we understand things. Ours is not a blind faith. Paul goes on and he says, you know what happens with people? They suppress that understanding because of the way they want to live their lives. Now we're getting real, all right? Right? Very few people have if they're open-minded and open-hearted, will they struggle with an intellectual quest for God? It's typically a moral one. It's typically an authority one. I don't want anybody telling me how to live my life. So it's best that I just not get too far into it, lest I discover that there may be a God. And if there is, that God probably commands my life in some way. Christians understand that faith begins with reason. Verse 6 brings it into further focus. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, him being God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So, all right, that makes sense. You cannot come to God unless you believe that God is real. Question, how do you know that something is real? You research it. You investigate it. For example, if I said to you, next month, I encourage you all to hike this trail. It's a bit hidden and out of the way, but there's a trail that winds its way up the back of Four Peaks. In the next month or two, if you hike this trail, chances are you are going to see some of the most beautiful wildflowers you have ever seen in your life. And you say, you know what, that sounds great. I'm going to go. And you begin walking toward the mountain. No, that's not what you're going to do. You don't just set out to do that. What do? Well, you're probably going to go online and you're going to do some research. You're going to investigate it. You might talk to some people that might be familiar with that area or maybe familiar with the hike. You might get a GPS. You might go out and buy a topographical map and study it. You're going to do your research, and what you're going to do is you're going to come to an understanding. Then you're going to head out, trusting, that's faith, that you're going to get there. What does the verse say? By faith we understand. This is a really important point because what's going to happen here is the author of Hebrews is going to say, can I help you? Can I place your mind in an understanding way? We're going to go back into the Old Testament. Now, I help you understand some things. And as you understand those things, what's going to happen is your faith will increase. Now, what's interesting is that many people, Christians that is, they have fallen away from the faith because they don't renew their faith by their thinking. So therefore, these are Christians that are very susceptible to being led astray and falling away because of the way they feel. Not because of what they understand, but because of what they feel. I'll give you an example. I grew up playing football. I was very slow, but I was always a little bit taller than the other guys. So coach put me in as quarterback and wide receiver. In one game, coach put me in special teams. I was going to cover a punt return. I'm just laying back of the field, okay? I'm letting someone else run down the field, make the tackle. I'm just laying low. I'm laying in the back, waiting for someone else to make the play. Ball carrier breaks through. It's just the two of us. People are watching. Now I got to make an open field tackle. What am I going to do? I got too much pride to let it go. I run in front of him. He buries his head down, plants it in my sternum. It drives me into the ground. I get up, I take one step on my left ankle, and immediately something's not right, and I fall to the ground. Trainer comes over, helps me off the field. X-rays reveal my ankle is shattered. I go to the doctor. The doctor says to me, no problem, no worries. We're going to take care of this, no problem. What we're going to do is we're going to go in, we're going to clean it up, clean it out. We're going to put 2 screws in. No problem, no big deal. I leave thinking, great, this is easy. Day of the surgery comes. They prep me, wheel me into the room. I see, sitting on a table, some really sharp instruments, like surgically sharp, scalpels, like torture devices. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's not looking good. I see the machine that they're going to hook me up to that's going to knock me out. And what happens in my mind? I start thinking, sometimes people die in surgery. Sometimes people don't make it out. And I start to lose what? Faith. Why? It has everything to do with where my mind is placed and the understanding that I have in that moment. Now, is the doctor more than qualified? Absolutely. Done hundreds of these surgeries. No problem. But my mind was not in a place of understanding. So in Matthew chapter 6, this is so good. Jesus is with his disciples, and they're freaking out. And Jesus says, why do you worry? In fact, he says, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious. Then he says this, consider the lilies. They're not stressing out. They're not anxious. They have everything they need to grow. They're doing just fine. God takes care of them. Do you not think he's going to take care of you? It's great because Jesus doesn't say, what are you freaking out about, man? Hey, just don't do that. Why are you so anxious? Hey, everything's just going to work out. No, he says, don't worry, and let me help you place your mind in the right spot. Look at these lilies. Know that God provides for them, and know and understand that God will provide for you. Faith, look at this now. This is really important to get. Faith comes by what? Understanding. Noah is a great example of how faith comes by understanding. His story is told in Genesis chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. We only get a couple of statements here in Hebrews. It's just listing Noah's story. Why? It's a summation, it's a summary. Certainly Jews in the first century would be well aware of the story of Noah. What they would not be aware of is that righteousness comes by faith, not by works. Judaism in the first century was steeped in a righteousness that was found in works. And so the author of Hebrews says, let me give you some examples. Men and women who have come before us, their righteousness is not in works, but it's found in their faith. Now, I'm going to summarize what happens here in chunks and bring you up to speed so we can move through the text in an orderly way and yet understand it. First few verses of chapter 6 describe an indescribable environment. It describes an indescribable environment. That is to say this. The text tells us that the world was in such a wicked and evil state. Every thought and every intention of man's heart was continuously evil. If you can imagine what kind of world, we're talking murder, violence, rape, abuse. The world is in a gnarly state of affairs. Not to mention the fact the first few verses seem to describe demons cohabitating with humans. Heavy demonic influence. And so what God does is he says, you know what? Reset. I'm going to push the reset button. In the midst of all of that worldly chaos, there is one righteous individual and his name is Noah. Verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. I can't imagine how challenging it would have been for Noah to remain faithful to God during this time. I take that back. I can understand it a bit, and I think many of you can too. It could be that in your work environment, you're the only one who cares anything about the things of God. Or maybe at your school, you're the only student who wants to imitate the life of Jesus. And everybody else thinks that is just ridiculous, lame. Or maybe you're in that class where it's not only the students who think that, but you have that teacher who has confused his own PhD with GOD. That happens a lot in places of higher, I've had a lot of higher education. Believe me, it happens a lot in places of higher education. And you're the only one. And man, you feel like you're swimming, and there's intense pressure. Or it might be that it's your family. And because you've chosen to be a follower of Jesus Christ, you have some very strong convictions. And those convictions have translated into a commitment. Not only do you have those convictions, but you're sticking to them and you're committed to them. And so your family is involved in things that they want you to approve of, and you refuse to do that. And so you're the bad person. See, you're the problem. You're the one that's causing family dysfunction. there can be tremendous pressure. We live in a post-Christian society, without a doubt. Listen, that's nothing new. That's nothing new. Going back to the time of Noah, being far worse, here you have this individual. This is why this man Noah should not be underestimated. This is a remarkable individual that in the midst of all of this evil chaos, he stands tall in the pocket and delivers for God. If you can imagine, the world is in such bad shape, there is only one dude on the planet that God is talking to, and that's Noah. And here's what he says in verse 13. Then God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth." So this is really insightful. This gives us understanding. The whole earth is filled with violence, just a horrible place. And God says, "I'm going to destroy it." Hey, Noah. Hey, since you and I are on speaking terms, and really you're the only one that I'm communicating with, I'm going to destroy the earth. I'm going to start over. It's been 1,500 years since Adam and Eve, give or take, and things have just gotten worse and worse. They keep offending God. They keep harming one another. Every intent is evil. You've got this cohabitation between demons and humans. And by the way, that could be Satan's ploy to thwart God's plan. Back in Genesis chapter 3, after the fall, what was said to Eve is, "Eve, you're going to have a descendant, and that descendant will deliver a death blow to Satan." This could be his way to thwart or stop that from coming true by demonizing the human race. Whatever the case, the world is in an incredibly bad place. It must have been staggering for Noah to hear this. But you see, this is where, in part, faith comes by understanding. Because Noah could understand the condition of the world. He could see it. He could see the depravity. He could understand judgment, but here's where the faith comes in. This kind of judgment on this scale, worldwide, he's never seen anything like that before. And so now when God is saying, "This is what I'm going to do," Noah's in that place of saying, "Never experienced this before, can hardly imagine what this is going to be like, but you said you're going to do it." And to make things more challenging for Noah, God says this in verse 14. "Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms and shall cover it inside and out with pitch." Pitch is, right, like a tarry substance. Back in the day, most likely made with pine tar, tar from trees. What is gopher wood? We don't know exactly. But here's what's interesting. God hasn't told Noah just yet exactly how he's going to destroy the world. You know what he says to Noah literally? You want to know what the literal translation is? "Noah, go build a box." The word ark, the Hebrew word for ark, means box. Check this out. It's the same word used to describe what Moses was placed in as a baby and floated down the Nile. Go build yourself a box. What do you, box? What? God hasn't even told Noah what he's going to do. "I want you to build a box." And by the way, there's a lot of people, many people dismiss the veracity. It's fictitious, right? This is just a fable, right? This is just one of those stories meant to communicate some moral truth, right? Isn't that what's going on in the Old Testament? Fables in this time do not contain the amount of specificity that you will see in this account. It just doesn't happen. The explanation doesn't come until verse 17. So this is a command, follow this now, without an explanation. Until verse 17, "I'm bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish." Wow. This is why you need a box. This is going to keep you safe from the floodwaters. Later, God will give specific instructions on how to build this giant box out of wood and pitch. Essentially, it's going to be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. I think we have a picture of this guy. Some Dutchman took the measurements and built this. Now, why does it have to be so big? Well, as you read on, as most, if not all of you know, there's going to be a sparing of animals so that the earth can be repopulated. Question: how in the world do you get an elephant or a giraffe on board a vessel like that? You know what the text says? God says, I'll draw them. God says, I will bring them. Okay, if you believe that God created the world ex nihilo, that is out of nothing, it's a very small thing for God to summon animals. Hey, by the way, here's something interesting. I was reading about this again this week as I was studying. In 2005, the tsunami that hit Sri Lanka, just before it hit Sri Lanka, you know what they observed? Elephants bolting away from the beach. In other words, it was almost as if they had what? A flood instinct, you might say, that drove them away up to higher ground, sensing that a flood was coming. You couldn't even see it yet, but the elephants are there. You can see it. I think there actually might be some video of these elephants storming across the beach and trying to get to higher ground. So a boat this big is going to take years and years to build. Faith comes by understanding. It's going to be 120 years before God makes good on that promise. It's going to take a long time to build a boat like that. Can you imagine being Noah? Day in and day out. Putting this thing together as his neighbors walk by. What is he doing? There is no rudder. There's no sail. This is a big wooden box. What kind of idiot is Noah? Oh, he's insane, everybody. And Noah keeps building year after year, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. See, Noah had this understanding. He understood what God was saying about the world was true. He could observe that. And he had faith to believe that God was going to follow through with what he said, even though he could not understand it, he couldn't see it, couldn't conceive of it. Noah is told that the water is going to be over the whole earth. Now, there are many really fine theologians whom I admire that believe it was a local flood. Why they believe it was a local flood is for this reason, one of the primary reasons. It says that the water is over the whole earth. That phrase, the whole earth, is also used to describe what happened to Joseph when he was in Egypt. And he had control over the food supply. And the text says the whole earth came to him. Now, is that literally the whole earth? Probably not. Probably a localized area or region. So some believe it wasn't a worldwide flood, it was a local flood. The thing about it, though, is the text says that the water was going to be as high as Mount Ararat, which is, I think, over 16,000 feet high. That's going to cover pretty much the earth. Whatever the case, this is God saying mankind is going to be blotted out, save the righteous. Noah. He says, I'm ending it. The demonic influence, the violence, the murder. It's over. You know, it's interesting because there is evidence, archaeological evidence, really interesting evidence for some kind of worldwide flood almost everywhere you go on the planet. I just think it's interesting. Let me put it to you this way. It can be understood. It can be understood. Anybody here familiar with El Centro? No, that's okay. El Centro is not exactly the hot spot for vacationing, but there are oysters. There are oyster shells in the deserts surrounding El Centro. There are seashells all along the Rocky Mountains. Years ago, a mammoth was discovered in the frozen tundra beyond Russia, and in its stomach there were tropical plants. They have found palm trees in core samples taken from Antarctica. The world at one time was a very, very different place than it is now. Understand? Faith comes by understanding. So there's a reason why his name is in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, it says, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. He had faith in what he could, I would say what he has never seen before, but he had faith in what couldn't be imagined. Because after 120 years, all of a sudden, this wet stuff starts falling from the sky. And according to Genesis chapter 2, before this time, rain had not fallen on the earth, but a mist used to cover the earth and provide moisture. I would imagine not too dissimilar from, you wake up in the morning and you can notice condensation on the ground sometimes, right? Water molecules on the grass. It hasn't rained, but it's almost as if there's a mist covering the ground. Until this time. And he acted. And he stayed faithful. And he was righteous. And there's some things we can understand. Here's one. Noah obeyed God when things were way beyond anything he could experience or conceive or comprehend. The essence of faith is to say, I don't understand everything, but I understand enough to put my faith in you. God says there's going to be a future judgment. It's going to be cataclysmic and worldwide. Never seen it, but I can understand. You're going to experience more water than you can imagine. Okay, I've experienced water. I understand. Secondly, I really believe that Noah I was thinking about this a lot this week. Noah was one of the greatest preachers of all time. Let me tell you this. Some of the men that have impacted my life the most, the greatest preachers I know have never worn a microphone and stood on a stage. But man, have they preached to me. St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. He's kind of right. At some point, you have to verbalize and articulate the gospel. It must be said. It must be heard. But preach it with your life, and that's exactly what Noah was doing, day in and day out. And that's why, by his actions, the text says he condemned the earth. People knew what was going on in Noah's day. I'm absolutely convinced of that. The Old Testament sacrificial system, they would have known, they would have been aware, but things had gotten to the place where they just didn't care about God. And God was patient, as he always is. As we saw him with Cain, gave the people 120 years to come to their senses as they saw and heard the work of Noah. So, have you thought about what your life is preaching? Have you thought about what can be known about God by virtue of the way you live your life? Because every single one of us, in that sense, is a message, is a testimony, and is a witness. Matthew 5:16 has long been one of my life verses. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they will see your good works, but don't make it about you. See your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Thirdly, Noah's faith was a blessing to his entire household. Moms, dads, grandmas, grandpas, brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, your faith can have a tremendous impact on those around you. You say, yeah, but they're not responding. Maybe not right now. But when the Holy Spirit prompts and when they're ready, you can know that they have a model in you. So finally the day comes. Clouds begin to form. Noah and his family enter the ark, and then verse 17. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That's in part how God did it. Some kind of pressurized, it's like an artesian well, right? Pressurized water underground springs forth. The rains come down. Windows of heaven are open. And rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So was Noah perfect? No. The rest of the story, as some of you know, he gets off the boat, does something dumb. He wasn't perfect, but he was righteous. And Noah understood, look, God is saying clearly to me one thing. There is only one way to be saved. And that way to be saved is to get on board this boat, in this box. That's it. There's only one way. Fast forward to our own day. God is saying the same thing, but it's not a boat. It's Jesus. And he's saying there's only one way to be rescued. Jesus is coming again. Not in the form of a humble child, but in the form of a conquering king. There is only one way to escape the judgment that's coming to the planet again. Well, how do we know that it's coming? Because we understand what has come before. What's the proof that Jesus is coming again? Because we understand that he has come once. You see? Faith comes by understanding. Ours is not a blind faith. So every single person in this room, we all have something to wrestle with. If you're here tonight and you don't know Jesus, you need to be rescued. You need to know him. You need to receive what he did for you on the cross, dying to set you free from yourself. That is the heart of sin, living for yourself. And for the rest of us, you know, we've all got those things in our lives that we're preaching messages, and we need to pray for one another, encourage one another, strengthen one another. The Bible says, and all the more as you see the day drawing near, the day that Jesus returns, and we are rescued. Father, our desire is just that. God, that you would be so real in our midst, that you would continue to just give us greater and greater understanding of who you are and what you want us to do and be. That our lives corporately as a church would just absolutely reflect the life of Jesus Christ, condemning those who refuse to believe and saving those who do. We pray it all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. And God's people said, amen.